Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today, this is going to be a solo episode. And I've had some feedback from some fans and stuff like that behind the scenes, kind of asking me to give my own take on some of the Shroud panel review shows that we've been doing. Obviously, on some of the shows, I've had so many guests that I haven't really been able to be a participant for everything, and I've had to stand back and be a host. So, yeah, obviously, we've had these great panel review shows so far, and out of deference to some of my friends and some of the fans here, I do want to give kind of a post panel show summary and where I'm at. Okay, I mentioned when I was first starting out that I usually do 3 rounds of a systematic, serious investigation for any topic that I do when I'm studying religiously. Now, obviously, in terms of my coming to faith and believing the Shroud is a miracle and writing up my 300-page Shroud chapter, I've already done more than the three. I've done the 3 rounds plus additional evidence analysis and stuff like that. But that's on the image formation specifically, the science of the images, how those minimal relevant features were formed. And that was the focus. I didn't care at all about the historicity of the Shroud. Now, when I came on to Skeptics and Seekers, I did 3 solo shows presenting the historical evidence, basically just doing a first round of investigation in a serious matter to present the various evidences for and against as I was aware of at that time. And now with the panel reviews, I'm considering this sort of my second of the 3 total rounds that I do, looking at the historicity of the Shroud to start with here through these panel reviews. And so I kind of want to give my follow up to the panel reviews, at least from parts 1 to part 3A right here. And okay, let me start assigning my own subjective probabilities. What do I make of the factors that we've discussed? And I think we've discussed about 8 topics. So we did the irrelevancy of the dating, the 1988 carbon-14 dating, and then the Hungarian Prey Codex in my Shroud panel review part 1. And there was a little bit on the Hungarian Prey Codex in my Shroud panel review part 3A. Then in my Shroud panel review part 2 with Mark Guskin, Joe Marino, Bob Rucker, and Hugh Ferry, we got into 3 more topics. The topics starting with the 1389 Bishop Darcy Memorandum and the surrounding medieval documents, as well as the medallion, the pilgrim's badge that allegedly proved the Shroud is medieval. We also got into the art history and numismatic coins argument that pro-Shroud proponents offer. So that was based on the Vinian markings, the Alan Wanger's forensic points of congruence or comparison, and then Dr. Giulio Fonte's 2015 statistical analysis and subsequent probabilistic analysis proving that the Shroud of Turin was used for certain gold solidus coins that he studied as the model there. And then we also finally got into the Sudarium of Oviedo, very strong evidence. In fact, in my Shroud solo show part 2, when I covered it, I said this was the slam dunk. This was proof beyond all reasonable doubt. So we're going to see what's my assessment now, 5 years later. Have I modified or am I the same? Where am I? And then in Shroud solo panel review show part 3A with Bob Rucker and Russ Brault and Hugh Ferry, we addressed 2 topics. So the the scientific dating tests outside of the carbon-14. So Ray Rogers' textile argument based on radiation damage, and also Giulio Fonte's 4 physical tests proving the Shroud dates to the 1st century. And then finally we got into the textile evidence. So I want to give my summary after listening to the panel shows, doing my research for the panel shows before, during, and after, and where am I on that front. Obviously, this will also incorporate subsequent shows, panel review part 3B with Giulio Fonte, and I'm hoping to have on Dr. DeCaro, who is also a co-author, to explain the maths behind the new X-ray dating. So far, nothing from him, so we'll see if that goes forward. And I'm in the works of possibly getting on Dr. Irene Tomidi one of the world's experts in the Shroud as a textile historian, an expert. So perhaps we can get her in a panel review, part 3C, addressing some of the things that came up about the textile evidence to finish that off. But yeah, with that said, so I want to go over it. And when I started, I was hoping to just do a summary show that would be an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours at most, and I would cover all of the topics very briefly. Not going into as much details because that's covered in the panel shows, and just say where I stand. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Even trying to avoid getting back into the details, I guess I just can't help myself. I got into a little bit of the details, and I'm well over 6 hours now. Well over 6 hours now, so I'm gonna have to break this up into individual parts. Maybe 2 topics per show of about 2 hours each, an hour and a half to 2 hours each, and yeah, I will assign my numbers. Now, one thing I just want to clarify before I get into the first thing about the irrelevancy of the dating aspect is I'm going to be assigning my own subjective probabilities to the various factors. And remember, when I do that, these are subjective probabilities, but I'm going to say whether or not I'm warranted in assigning them or not, in my opinion, based on the sufficiency of my research and what I've learned in the panel shows and from talking to experts and all of that, given the data that I have. So I'm gonna say, am I warranted or not in my judgment? And so, for example, with carbon-14, I would say I am warranted, given I know enough to be warranted in saying that those results are useless at proving the Shroud is in fact probably medieval. I know enough based on Bob Rucker's explanations and the neutron absorption hypothesis and some of the other issues that come up. Yep, I can say the skeptic is not warranted, 50% or less, proven on that front. However, when it comes to more specific details, for example, the invisible reweave hypothesis, I'm going to make a judgment about it, and not in its favor. I think it's very probably false, but I have to admit I don't feel I'm warranted. I'm just giving my percentage as a rationally justified opinion. Just meaning justification in epistemology. I've got, I think, reasons or appropriate reasons to assign that thing, but that doesn't mean that I'm right or true or that I have knowledge, because knowledge is a warranted true belief. And in the case of the invisible reweave, I've got more research to do. For example, I've gone over Joe Marino's book, but I haven't read it cover to cover fully. If I'm going to have a warranted opinion, Joe Marino has presented the best case for the invisible reweave hypothesis that I know of. I've got to read the entire thing, not just, I've scanned over lots and lots of it because Joe is kind enough to send me his book. But I sat down and read it cover to cover? No. And because of that, I'm going to be giving my subjective probability as a rationally justified number. So that's just saying, well, given the reasons I'm aware of as of right now, this is where I'm at. But I admit that what I know right now is insufficient. I need to investigate further to have a warranted opinion. So most of the stuff I'll be presenting, it will be a warranted opinion. I will try my best to identify when I only have a rationally justified opinion in terms of the probabilities I assign. Second announcement here, in terms of my subjective probabilities, obviously I'm going to be using Bayes' theorem to come up with a cumulative case when we're assessing premise 2. Is it true that what the Shroud skeptic says, is the Shroud provably or probably medieval? Is that premise true or false? And there's going to be various evidences contributing, right? Hungarian Pre-Codex, the Sudarium of Oviedo, the radiocarbon dating, the textile evidence, all of this good stuff, historical inaccuracies, all of this stuff. And I'm going to be using Bayes' theorem and then plugging all of my subjective probabilities for each factor into that to get, okay, what is the overall truth of this premise? Is the Shroud probably medieval or not? So that's the goal. Basically, I just wanted to clarify something that when I'm assigning these probabilities, when you're using Bayes' theorem to get the cumulative probability, the way it understands, if I were to plug in 45% or 30%, that is like saying that it's improbable that the hypothesis is true. It's almost like it understands it as a separate hypothesis. So you have your hypothesis that the shroud is not medieval. That's the pro-shroud side. So anything that in Bayes' theorem that is 51% or over 50% to 100% means that yes, it's probably true the shroud is not medieval. If you're at 50% in Bayes' theorem, that understands of, well, maybe it's probably medieval, maybe it's not probably medieval. And then anything 49% or less than 50% down to 0% means that, look, a positive claim or a new hypothesis, no, it probably is medieval kind of thing. So it's the opposite hypothesis to what I'm trying to prove. So that's different. Most people think, look, when I'm evaluating evidences, like if I said, based on this evidence, I think I'm only 30%, it's only 30% probable that this thing is true or something like that. That's basically saying, or sorry, that we can prove that this given hypothesis is true, right? So that's just saying, well, look, we've got some evidence here, but it's insufficient. It's not enough to prove on a balance of probabilities and stuff like that, right? But it's not 0%. We don't have nothing. We do have some kind of reasons or some kind of evidence that at least warrants us to be 30% confident that the shroud is medieval, let's say, for example. So that's, great, grand, and groovy. That's the way most people think in terms of probability assignments, right? For a given piece of evidence, what is the probability that this evidence proves that the hypothesis is true? And it can go anywhere from 0 to 100%. But what I'm trying to say here is, for our purposes, because I'm using Bayes' theorem, anything, if I assign 50% or less, anything from 0 to 50% probability for my subjective probability, means that it is a failure. It is entirely ignored from my Bayesian calculation. And it's, again, because the way Bayes' theorem understands probabilities of 50%, 50% does nothing. That's the equivalent of you saying, based on this evidential factor, I think there's 0% proof that, the shroud is medieval or probably medieval. That's the way to understand it. There's an equally probability that the shroud is probably medieval or that the shroud is probably not medieval. Both these separate claims are equally probable because the evidence that's presented provides us with 0% proof for either of the hypotheses. So we would assign 50% in Bayes' theorem. That you just have to trust me. That's the way the calculation works. If I were to assign anything 49% to 0%, again, that thinks that you're saying, well, I can prove, based on this evidence, the shroud is probably not medieval. It's like a separate claim. It's saying that you could positively know that the shroud is probably not medieval. And that's not what we want to claim, right? If I present a weak piece of evidence, let's say the Hungarian Praecodex, for the sake of argument, let's say it sucks, I botch it, I present all the evidence for it, and you're like, oh my goodness, to me, there's only like a 10% chance that proves the shroud is not medieval. Okay, just for the sake of argument. Well, we wouldn't plug in 10% into Bayes' theorem, because that would be like saying that if the main hypothesis is that the shroud is not medieval, for the sake of argument, if I plugged in 10%, that would be, Bayes' theorem would understand that as me saying, look, there is a 90% chance that the shroud is medieval. No, the fact that the Hungarian Praecodex evidence sucks and is only provides us with 10% warrant, that doesn't entail that the shroud is medieval. It just means that the evidence that we have doesn't prove that it's not medieval. I have no idea if I'm confusing you guys or whatever, but just trust me. For the sake of argument, in terms of the mathematics of Bayes' theorem and how the calculation works with the probabilities I'm using as straightforward probabilities and not conditional probabilities or whatever, Just trust me. Anything that's 50, I assign a 50% or less probability of proving the given hypothesis, um, should be ignored from the Bayesian calculation. It's a failure. It just doesn't count at all. Okay, with that said, 15 minutes wasted. Let's get straight into this. Assessment, and in this show, part one of my summary, we will start with the irrelevancy of the dating and then the carbon-14 dating. One last note. So in terms of my overall summary, again, I was originally planning for this to be one show, and now I'm having to break it up because it's just way too long. So it's going to just kind of end abruptly and awkwardly. And then with the next part 2 of 4, it's going to be starting up awkwardly without an proper intro or anything like that. So just be aware that, yeah, there's going to be 4 parts to this one show that's supposed to be a summary of the results and my findings on what we've covered in my 3 first panel review shows. And I'm going to wait till the end, part 4 of 4, where I give my overall summary of all the evidences that I've talked about, how they relate to the premise that the Shroud is probably medieval. Yeah, so we'll do an overall assessment at the end, not of this video specifically, which is going to be part 1 of 4 now, but wait till part 4 of 4, and then I'm going to put it all together into a helpful table, and hopefully it all makes sense to you guys. So yeah, just bear with me. It's going to be a little bit awkward because I was originally planning this to be one show, and now it's going to be 4 shows. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so the first topic that I addressed in my Shroud panel reviews, show number 1, was the irrelevancy of the dating. And essentially what I did, as you can see from the slide on your YouTube screens there, is I said that the Shroud skeptic makes a twofold claim, and they bear the burden of proof to establish both premises. Premise number 1 is that, so the way I phrased it originally in the show itself was premise number 1. If the Shroud is provably medieval, then the Shroud images are not miraculous signs from God that Christianity is true. Premise number 2, the Shroud is provably medieval, therefore the Shroud images are not miraculous signs from God that Christianity is true. So this is a logically valid deductive argument pattern known as affirming the antecedent. Basically it has the first premise as a conditional, and it's affirming that antecedent of that conditional is true, therefore it's guaranteed that the consequent must be true. If it's true that the Shroud is medieval, then it can't be miraculous sign from God. And I was pleasantly surprised that both Hugh, the Shroud skeptic, and Bob Rucker seemed to be on board with me, saying that the Shroud skeptic really can't provide the warrant for the truth of this first premise. And that's something that I've received pushback on from several lay Shroud skeptics and even pro-Shroud proponents and that sort of thing over the years. And I in the show, panel show number 1, I went over, various 6 attempts of the Shroud skeptic to try and provide warrant to believe that premise number 1 is true, and I believe I refuted every single one of those. And in fact, both Bob and Hugh, the Shroud skeptic, agreed with me that I was successful in defeating those proposed things for warrant. So therefore, yeah, the skeptic cannot prove the truth of premise 1. So I'd just say, take a look at my Shroud panel review show, part 1, the first 30 minutes of the episode, after the intro, maybe, the first 7 to 32 minute mark of that episode, I cover in my PowerPoint slides and go over in the show in detail what these 6 attempts at warranting premise 1 are by Fundy Shroud skeptics over the years, and along with my sound refutations against those attempts at warranting the first premise. Now, I do have to just say this, that obviously Bob and Hugh did raise objections to some of the terminology, right? So in the first place, they both said, well, they're scientists, so they would object to saying, well, if the Shroud is provably medieval. And I clarified, well, when I say the word provably, I'm a philosopher, right? I'm a logician. I'm higher than the scientists. Science is a second order discipline, or whereas philosophy is opposite way. Science is a first order discipline, I believe, and philosophy is the second order discipline. Logic underpins every other discipline. That's why the university, there's a philosophy of science program, or the philosophy of history, but you don't have the science of philosophy. Philosophy comes first. So I know what I'm talking about here when it comes to provability. That said, it's true within the scientific discipline. Scientists are taught to say, never say the word prove. That's only for mathematicians and stuff like that. So catering to their limitations of their discipline that they are experts in, I clarified, look, by provably, the Shroud is provably medieval. I'm just saying it's probably medieval. It's been proven on a balance of probabilities. That's what this premise means by the word term provably. And on that front, okay, they were all agreed with that. That was fine. So I can update the premise to say the Shroud is probably medieval. Then the Shroud images are not miraculous sign, and I should say probably not miraculous signs from God that Christianity is true. Premise 2, the Shroud is probably medieval. Therefore, probably the Shroud images are not miraculous signs from God. Now, the second objection to the terminology was this term miraculous. Both Bob and Hugh brought up a tangential issue, but it's important to clarify if they're going to say they agree with the premise or not. This word miraculous, what does it mean? And at first, Hugh brought up a very loosey-goosey type because there have been levels of miracles, and he says, oh, well, the miracles of birth or the miracle, loosey-goosey miracles in terms of the Shroud's impact emotionally and over history on people, that could be considered miraculous. And I ruled that out. I said, no, that's not the sense of the word miraculous that we're looking at in this premise. We're looking at something stronger, something along the lines of supernatural and or at the very least an extraordinary event, a miraculous event that could only have been done by God and is beyond the laws of nature or mechanisms, ordinary natural mechanisms that we are aware of today. They couldn't get it done beyond our scientific understanding and the laws of physics at this time. If you want to call that supernatural, great. I have no problem with saying supernatural. I'm a Christian. I believe the resurrection or turning the water into wine is a supernatural event. There's no problem using that word. Some atheists and skeptics are hypersensitive to that word, and that's the reason that Hugh and Bob are hesitant to use supernatural, and I totally respect that. I also strategically will avoid the use of the word supernatural as well and talk about extraordinary events or religious authenticating events, or an event that's been designed by God to authenticate the Christian religion, or just any event designed by God for a specific given purpose. In the case of miraculous healings, that's not to authenticate Christianity, I don't think, although Caleb Jackson would disagree with me. I think that's more about healing for the purpose of compassion on God's part. This is kind of besides the point, because Hugh himself gave that great example. Look, even if you use it miraculous in the strongest sense, let's plug in supernatural there, the hardest word. Surely Bob and Hugh would believe in what most people understand the term supernatural to be, and even that wouldn't be ruled out. And Hugh gave that great example of, well, look, there have been claimed Shroud copies that have been formed miraculously by themselves, beyond the laws of physics, beyond our understanding of the current laws of physics, or it's an i.e. extraordinary event clearly designed by God. Again, if true, I'm just assuming the facts are true here. I know nothing about these claimed miraculous copies of the Shroud that happened in Spain that he was referring to, but assuming that happened for the sake of argument, just assuming those facts, yes, that would be a supernatural event. I have no problem using that word. If you do, whatever. It's miraculous, sign from God, in the sense that it's extraordinary or beyond our understanding of physics or the laws of nature and naturalistic mechanisms. That's all I need. And both agreed that there's no problem here in terms of that sense of miraculous. Yeah, if the Shroud is probably medieval, that no way proves or necessitates the fact that the Shroud images could not be miraculous signs from God that Christianity is true. Bob agreed, and remarkably, Hugh agreed as well. So basically, yeah, it's game over for the Shroud skeptics who want to make this claim. We could give up right now about the dating of the Shroud and say, cool, pretend it is. Shroud skeptics, you've won. The Shroud's medieval. Who cares? It's still a miraculous proof. Let me present to you the scientific evidence from Stirp talking about the image features and all of that, and that's sufficient. I can prove that there's a miracle. We don't have to get into the questions about the dating. I'll just grant for the sake of argument that this is a medieval cloth. This is an option to us. And even Hugh Ferry, the ultimate Shroud skeptic, probably the most intelligent and knowledgeable Shroud skeptic in the world, agreed that, yeah, if he does all the work and proves that the Shroud's medieval, that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. That in and of itself does nothing to disprove the miraculous nature of the Shroud images. Now, one little caveat that I want to raise here is that I don't want to say that I'm saying that all historical indicators or dating indicators are totally irrelevant in terms of disproving the Shroud's miraculous nature, or the Shroud image's miraculous nature, rather. Now, to kind of clarify this, so for example, the dating itself, what my irrelevancy of the dating argument is, or defeater is saying, is that specifically the dating in and of itself is totally irrelevant. It is a failure as an argument on the part of the Shroud skeptic. In my opinion, it's less than 50% proven, therefore it should be dismissed. So, things like the textile. So let's say the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry proves based on the textile evidence, just for the sake of argument, or something like that, that the medieval Shroud cloth was produced during the medieval period. That's something where totally irrelevant. Who cares? God zapped that cloth and went poof, and a miraculous image came. Or perhaps God zapped and went poof, and the cloth came out ex nihilo, out of wholesale type thing. Again, I'm not proposing these as to what really happened. I'm just saying these are equally plausible and equally probable explanations for the origin of the Shroud. So that would be consistent with the Shrouds being medieval, and yet we have evidence of its miraculous nature via the scientific evidence from Stirp about the physical and chemical properties, or what I call the minimal relevant features of these Shroud images. Okay, so by contrast then, what am I saying? What kind of historical dating indicators or evidences might be relevant or significant to some degree in terms of disproving the Shroud image's miraculous nature? And with that, basically, it relates to only one of the 6 ways or sources of warrant that Shroud skeptics have provided in favor of the truth of the premise 1 conditional argument that we're assessing here. And basically that's from the contextual indicators. So I think that if there are certain historical inaccuracies related to the Shroud man, those could potentially argue or are significant in speaking against the authenticity of the Shroud as a miraculous sign from God. So think, for example, if the Shroud man portrays Jesus with historically inaccurate wounds that don't fit what we know of ancient Roman crucifixion or ancient Roman scourging, or, hypothetically, if Shroud skeptics like to say, well, the Shroud man has long hair, that's a medieval reflection. Jews in Jesus' day, he had short hair, he was in the Greco-Roman style, he was not, the medieval conception of Jesus as we see on the Shroud. Things like this are potentially relevant. Again, assuming, if true, pretend the skeptic proves his case here. If true, that is potentially relevant or seemingly relevant. Why on earth would God produce miraculous images in the medieval period that were historically inaccurate? That does, at the very least, at face value, prima facie, make God seem to be a deceiver, a trickster, a liar. He's using falsity to try and prove that Christianity is true in some way, and that doesn't fit God's MO. God is a God of truth, right? So, yeah, that at least at face value, this is seemingly problematic and would suggest that God had nothing to do with creating these images, even if they are extraordinary. Maybe Satan made them or something like that. And that would take some justification. I think that we can number one, in the first place, we can refute these, and we'll get to that in future panel shows. We're going to say, yeah, but guess what? The Shroud Man is not historically inaccurate. The Shroud skeptic is wrong in saying that the Shroud Man or the way the Shroud indicates the burial took place is historically inaccurate. We're going to see that's not true. Actually, it is accurate. But beyond disputing the facts, even if it was historically inaccurate, I still think the significance of that is very low. I do think it's more probable than not that it's false, that God would produce miracles that were miraculous images that were historically inaccurate, but it's still plausible. And I, I would probably at best give it a 60% probability that that the images are not miraculous signs from God if they have historically inaccurate representations. But there's still 40% possibility to my mind that there can be reasons, plausible reasons, as to why God would produce historically inaccurate, miraculous images of the Shroud Man while attesting to the truth of Christianity. Again, remember, the scientific evidence from Stirp is still there. It remains the same. The proof that these images are in fact miraculous remains the same regardless of these questions. Regardless of whether they're historically inaccurate or not, the images are still three-dimensional. They're still photonegatives. They're still vertically mapped. They're still superficial. All of that evidence stays the same. This is the point of my irrelevancy of the dating argument. But the question is, well, okay, if they're extraordinary in nature or supernatural in nature, whatever word you want to use, miraculous, whatever, we also have this indication, but would God do this to authenticate Christianity? Would he produce these extraordinary images and with historically inaccurate information? That's a bit problematic, I think. But nonetheless, Molinistically speaking, I can think of certain reasons for it. Perhaps that was the only way to preserve the cloth. If God zapped miraculous images onto a medieval cloth in front of Geoffrey de Charny or whoever, and it portrayed Jesus accurately in a Greco-Roman style, he would have rejected it and ripped it up. Oh, this is from Satan. No, Jesus didn't look like this. He looks like how I think he looks like in the medieval conception type deal, right? Maybe that's why God had to make it historically inaccurate so that it would be acceptable. Again, that isn't a totally satisfactory answer, like especially when we get into certain details. Really, would a medieval man reject it if he had the scourge wounds slightly off or something? No, come on. So yeah, the point is here, you have to get into these alleged historical inaccuracies on a case by case basis. Some are relevant, some aren't. Some are more relevant than others, and we have to assess: is it in fact true that there are any historical inaccuracies in the first place? And like I said, that's where pro-Shroud experts will deny that emphatically and say, no, it is historically accurate to the time of Jesus. So that's where we're going to get into the debate on a future, probably the panel review show part 4. I'm hoping to bring on some biblical scholars and as well medical experts or forensic anatomical experts to discuss these kinds of questions in some future point. But yeah, so that's it. I just wanted to make that clarification in terms of the irrelevancy of the dating. With that said, that's it for that topic. Let's move on to the next topic in the discussion based on the Shroud panel review show number 1. This is, of course, the infamous 1988 carbon-14 dating. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the next topic. So that's it for premise 1. And as you can see up on your YouTube screens, here's that argument again. Our first premise, the conditional premise: if the Shroud is probably medieval, then it's probably not a miraculous or extraordinary or supernatural sign from God that Christianity is true. And we've just disproven that premise. All sides agree. Even the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry agrees. The skeptic has no warrant for the truth of that premise. So right away, this argument's a failure, and it's deductively weak. But we also have to assess premise 2, because this is where the majority of debate happens in terms of the historicity of the Shroud. Is it a fact that the second premise, the evidential premise, that the Shroud is in fact probably medieval? Is that true or false? And on that front, there have been several lines of evidence from both sides that we need to address and that we've been addressing on this podcast. On the Shroud skeptical side, there have been lots of Shroud skeptics who have offered various evidences or arguments to try and warrant the truth of premise two here. Yes, it's true that the Shroud is probably medieval, and we're going to look at those in due time. But on the other side, pro-Shroud scientists and experts have also submitted several lines of evidence and arguments saying, no, it's false. Premise two is false. The Shroud is not probably medieval. So we're going to look at that. And looking at my first three panel shows, we've already addressed some of these arguments. So let's start with the Shroud skeptical side first. And the first of that in Shroud panel review show number 1 was obviously the carbon-14 dating that took place in 1988 and allegedly showed the Shroud to be dating from 1260 to 1390 plus or minus 65 years with a 95% degree of certainty or confidence that those results are true. Now, I'm not going to go over everything that we discussed. Go to Shroud panel review show number 1, or between Bob Rucker and Hugh Ferry, and kind of see the debate on that front. So I'm not going to recap that. Or you can go to my prior shows between Bob Rucker versus Hugh Ferry, or Joe Marino versus Hugh Ferry, and so on and so forth, where we get into a lot of detail on the carbon-14 dating and the various proposals that Christians and pro-Shroud experts have offered to either undercut the truth of the carbon dating or to rebut the carbon-14 dating as evidence for the Shrouds being probably medieval. Again, I'm not going to go over and rehash all of that. I just want to give a quick recap. Basically, in terms of where I am on this front, I'm exactly where I started from. I presented on the show, and back in 2018, when I was doing my first round of investigation on the carbon-14, I submitted that there was 4 undercutting defeaters. So a defeater is something that defeats one's epistemic justification or warrant for believing that a premise is true. And there's 2 types of defeaters. So there's an undercutting defeater. So this says, look, I don't bear any burden of proof, but I'm just saying, what if? I'm throwing out objections that potentially say, hey, you, Mr. Skeptic, you're the one claiming that the Shroud is probably medieval, and how? Because the 1988 carbon-14 dating tells you so, or proves that. And I'm saying, well, how do you know? How are you justified? And on that front, I threw out 4 different things, right? So number 1, I tried the general unreliability of the AMS carbon-14 dating. Secondly, they only tested 1 sample location instead of multiple locations from different parts in the Shroud. Originally, they had planned to test 3 different sample locations. And as Dr. Harry Gove said, I quoted him, proving that no scientist in their right mind would be justified or warranted in believing that the Shroud is medieval on the basis of carbon dating 1 sample location. Thirdly, I pointed to some of the empirical evidence surrounding the fact that the Shroud sample was non-representative to the rest of the cloth. So this is what people like Joe Marino or Ray Rogers point to try and advance the invisible reweave hypothesis. And then finally is Bob Rucker, the statistical problems and the provable, demonstrable, systematic bias, or as Bob says, error that is proven with the carbon-14 dates, proving again the sample was non-representative to the rest of the cloth, and you can't trust any of the results that was obtained in terms of believing the Shroud's actual calendar age is medieval on this carbon-14 basis. Nor even probably medieval on this basis. Okay, so what do I make in terms of updates? So one major update here is I have kind of given up on the first undercutting defeater that I offered here. So I will no longer appeal to the general unreliability of the AMS carbon-14 dating method. Even Bob Rucker, pro-Shroud expert, who's an expert in this, area as a nuclear engineer, and he understands the carbon-14 dating. Even he said, no, this isn't true. The values were accurate that they got in the labs. And the AMS carbon-14 dating method has been proven to be generally reliable, not just subsequent to it, but at the time we know it was generally reliable as well. And I pointed to various cases to say, well, what about there was various studies at that time showing they were not getting the proper results. And basically Bob and Hugh agreed that's true. There were reasons for that, though. In those cases, due to contamination or something happened that we know about, and those problems didn't apply to the AMS carbon-14 dating of the Shroud in particular. And Bob mentioned about the rigorous cleaning process they went to, for example, so there would be no contamination. So on that front, I think that the first undercutting defeater I proposed has been defeated. There's a defeater, as philosophers like to say, kind of thing, and make it complicated. So yes, I think that we should dismiss this and no longer use this to get people to doubt or to undercut people's belief in the carbon-14 dating results. Now, in terms of the second one, the fact that there was only one sample location tested, which is an insufficient sample size for one to have confidence in the results. Now, both Bob and Hugh disagreed with Dr. Harry Gove, the guy who invented the AMS carbon-14 dating, when he said,
quote unquote, the new procedure suggested by the Cardinal of Torino, whereby we change from 7 carbon AMS labs down to 3 AMS labs and 3 sample locations in different parts of the Shroud, just one Shroud sample location, is bound to produce a dating result that will be questioned in strictly scientific terms by many scientists around the world, who will be extremely skeptical of the arbitrarily small statistical basis for our testing. The use of a single sample is ill-advised, as it will not generate a reliable date, but will rather give rise to world controversy. We suggest that it would be better not to date the Shroud at all.
And once again, Bob and Hugh both agreed that no, actually, you should believe the results they got were accurate. And again, the rigorous pre-cleaning treatment they did would take care of any possible contaminations or ordinary contaminants and that sort of thing. Now, basically what they said is, well, look, I remember at one point Hugh was saying, why would this be an issue? The fact that they only tested one sample, that's mutually exclusive with trying to explain away the accurate carbon-14 results, right? That's what the invisible reweave hypothesis is meant to explain. Yes, you got these dates and you were accurate in your measurements in getting those raw dates, but you messed up because guess what? That was a medieval invisible reweave patch. Or with Bob Rucker's neutron absorption hypothesis, that's a hypothesis to explain. It accepts by definition that the results of the raw values obtained were accurate. And then says, yeah, but they don't reflect the true or accurate actual calendar age of the Shroud of Turin. Why? Because there was a neutron flux. Or in Joe Marino's case, why? Because it's an invisible reweave. Now, one thing I just want to say, again, Bob and Hugh are not philosophers, so I think that they're wrong. On the question of epistemic justification, I'm still going to use this single sample location, not because I believe that the results were inaccurate, kind of thing. No, I'm of the same opinion of Bob Rucker, personally. That's what I believe is the truth. But when it comes to undermining or undercutting one's epistemic warrant or justification, you're allowed to take on board to ask questions that are mutually exclusive or based on mutually exclusive proposals, right? And that lowers your degree of confidence, even though you don't believe that, oh yeah, that the results obtained were inaccurate. That's still possible and plausible, I would argue, and that should lower one's epistemic justification.
And this, again, comes down to simple logic, right? Or Bayesian reasoning. You have to take account of all and add up the sum of all contrary hypotheses to compare to your privileged hypothesis. In this case, the hypothesis of the Shroud skeptic that the carbon-14 dating results accurately reflect the actual calendar age of the Shroud as being probably medieval, and therefore prove it's probably medieval. Remember, the burden of proof is solely on the Shroud skeptic, claiming that the carbon-14 dating results are accurate. They're not on the person who's questioning them, unless they're making a rebutting defeater. At this point, we're only making an undercutting defeater. I'm undercutting his justification. So the Shroud skeptic has a compound claim where he has to prove and establish multiple aspects. He has to, number one, prove, yes, the AMS carbon dating is generally reliable. We said they could do that. And they have to prove that the dates obtained were accurate, given they only tested one sample location. And they have to prove that there's not an invisible reweave, or that the sample tested was sufficiently representative of the rest of the cloth. And they have to take on that it was sufficiently representative via addressing Bob Rucker's systematic error concern. So it's a conjunction, it's a compound claim that the skeptic's making, and therefore that involves multiple avenues of doubt, of the burden of proof, multiple aspects that the Shroud skeptic has to address. And, and there's others too. And there wasn't a conspiracy theory. Hugh Ferry added that there's a few conspiracy theories. They have to prove those aren't true as well. So it's on the skeptic who alone bears the burden of proof. So long as one is just making an undercutting defeater, they have to provide a defeater for every single one in order for their, at least on a balance of probabilities. Remember, it's probably false. The conspiracy theories are probably false. The Bob Rucker's thing is probably false. Invisible reweave is probably false. And then at the end, you get that cumulative thing. If the hypothesis is more probable relative to the conditional probabilities of all these, the sum of all of these contrary hypotheses, only then is the skeptic warranted in establishing his claim, his compound claim about believing the Shroud's medieval on the basis of the carbon-14 dating results.
Now, obviously, the next two categories of undercutting defeaters, they go, okay, well, I think we can assume that the dates were in fact accurate, though. The raw date values that they got. Okay, cool. So let's pretend I'm wrong in that, and we should agree with Bob and Hugh. No, we can be 100% confident that the values they got were accurate, regardless of the fact they only dated one sample. Even still, we have empirical evidence, and I listed a bunch of them. So let me just bring that up. Things like the blue quad mosaic. They found cotton in the sample location, and Dr. Alan Adler talks about salt. He found salt, and this would mess things up. There's a question of whether wax or starch contamination might have thrown off the dates by up to centuries. And then finally, Giovanni Righi and Harry Gove, the ultimate Shroud skeptic, invented AMS carbon-14 dating and dated the Shroud in a desperate, godless attempt to destroy belief in Christianity. He admitted there was contamination in the area that was carbon dated. So all of these factors are things that people like Joe Marino use, along with trying to establish the prior probability of the fact that the French had an invisible reweave technology,
thus establishing the plausibility of the invisible reweave hypothesis. And finally, Joe Marino also appeals to the argument from scholarly consensus, not the fallacy of appeal to authority, but multiple scholars, about 20 he quotes in his book, he mentions, and in his papers, including the famous STURP chemist and scientist Dr. Ray Rogers, who was a skeptic, and he set out to disprove this. When he first heard Joe Marino and Sue Benford talking about the invisible reweave, he was talking to Barry Schwartz saying, "This is horse trash. I'll disprove this nonsense in 5 minutes." Did his scientific research, and oops, it's not nonsense. He became a believer in the invisible reweave hypothesis. So I think that these empirical findings suggesting the Shroud sample was reweave or non-representative, along with Joe Marino, the argument from the plausibility, books talking about that they had an invisible reweave method in France, and apparently textile experts or some people quoting that there are such textiles, although there is a question. There's never been like a clear example given. And then finally, this argument from scholarly consensus. So these are the three arguments. Obviously, there's counters to each of these. I think that the empirical findings have all been kind of defeated, in my opinion, by people like Bob Rucker or Hugh Ferry. So I don't think they prove an invisible reweave. The only one that I've never heard counters to is Al Adler's notion of salt proving something. But again, I'm sure there's something I just haven't come across that could counter and say, well, actually, that can be interpreted in other ways other than an invisible reweave. And there's counters to the plausibility arguments. Again, why is it there's never seen? And Bob Rucker has provided counter arguments, very strong, in my opinion, proving that there's a contradiction. It can't be an invisible reweave. But yeah, once again, Joe Marino, I think he does have the scholarly consensus argument that still remains persuasive, in my opinion, and stuff like that.
This supports the invisible reweave hypothesis. And on this front, Bob was saying, no, all these factors are totally useless and refutable. They should not lower your confidence at all in the truth of the carbon-14 dating results. Hugh Ferry, the Shroud skeptic, ironically enough, was not quite as confident. He said, no, these factors were empirical findings and they should lower your confidence, but not by much. I mean, it's still very, very probable that the carbon-14 dating is accurate in terms of saying the Shroud is medieval, because there are defeaters for these empirical findings that people like Joe Marino use to try and establish that the Shroud carbon-14 sample was non-representative to the rest of the cloth on account of it being an invisible reweave during the medieval period. Now, obviously, I said I myself have been convinced by people like Bob Rucker and Hugh Ferry. I think in my Shroud Wars debates with Joe Marino on the invisible reweave, they've had very good defeaters for these things and explanations that doesn't require there to be an invisible reweave. I think they've given good arguments to question the plausibility of there being an invisible, of someone even having invisible reweave technology in the medieval period. And then we also have factual textile experts who've examined the cloth saying that there is no invisible reweave and it would be impossible for it to escape the attention of modern textile experts. In fairness, obviously, this is a technical discussion. I mean, Joe Marino has heard, and Barry Schwartz and Russ Brault, all these experts that still go for the invisible reweave, they've heard all of these counters before, and they've written entire books addressing it. So again, I'm not going to go into the details there, but essentially where I'm at with this, I still believe that the invisible reweave is a plausible hypothesis or a viable hypothesis. By that, it just means there's a 5% probability or more that it could be true. And in my estimation with my subjective probabilities, I would definitely assign it probably 5 to 10%. And therefore, it is a viable hypothesis that needs to be debated and looked at and discussed. So I would disagree with Bob that it should just be dismissed as though there's a 0% probability that it could be true. But I'm more in line with Hugh that at the end of the day, it's very improbable that the invisible reweave hypothesis is true. So that's just my take, but I will still use that. I think this should still be a part of the pro-Shroud case, and Shroud skeptics should have to address it, just as Hugh has done, or in this case, Bob Rucker, who's a skeptic of the invisible reweave, he's provided defeaters for these things. Okay, cool. So then we get to the statistical evaluation and the neutron absorption hypothesis stuff. I'm going to let that stand based on what Bob and Hugh have said in their first debate on my Shroud Wars series, as well as what they said in Shroud War in my panel review, show number 1. And what was shocking here is, look, they both agreed that the carbon dating, in light of Bob Rucker's work on the calculating the 16 raw values and showing that it has a slope of 36 centimeters per 36 years per centimeter, that means the best line of fit follows that slope, given all 16 values that we got. It's not due to measurement errors like the biased, atheistic, and godless carbon 14 scientists liked to say back in those days. And yes, I know he was not going to like me saying that. I'm being a bit jokey here, but in all seriousness, look, Hugh admits Bob Rucker's hypothesis and explanation for the carbon 14 dating is an equally probable explanation. And because of that, even Hugh admits the carbon 14 dating completely useless in and of itself to prove one way or the other in terms of what the actual calendar age of the Shroud of Turin is. You either have to decide, the only way to discern who's right about the carbon 14 is to do further testing to try and falsify or verify either Bob Rucker's theory or Hugh Ferry. He had his own thoughts as to what might explain the systematic bias issue and the slope problem of the carbon 14 dates. Basically, they're just equally probable, which means we've undercutted the Shroud skeptics' proof or warrant for believing the Shroud is medieval on the basis of the carbon 14. I want to stress here, Hugh is quite clear that he says, but that's only in explanatory isolation because he believes the Shroud is medieval for other reasons, having nothing to do with the carbon 14. And in light of those other reasons, that's why he thinks that the carbon 14, his hypothesis, should be privileged over Bob's, and we should believe the Shroud's medieval. The carbon 14 just provides supporting evidence or buttressing evidence for that. But again, the point is here, we're looking at the carbon dating in isolation. On that front, Hugh says utter failure, Shroud skeptics, proves nothing in and of itself. Absolutely bupkiss. Don't believe me, funny lady Shroud skeptics? Well, let's have your expert, Hugh Ferry, say it in his own words. Take a look at this. All right, cool. So just kind of finishing this part off then with Hugh, because I just want to, I understand Bob's position, and my position is the same as his, that this represents what Bob is saying. It represents an undercutting defeater. It undercuts someone's justification for saying the Shroud is medieval or probably medieval, 51% or more, on the basis of the 1988 carbon 14 dating alone, the empirical data. Now, you said you agreed with that.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of hypotheses. You'll perhaps know that I posted, I think, on the Shroud Science Group thing a little while ago. I think I'm allowed to say what I posted, even if it's a confidential thing. That someone has demonstrated that the caves, in particular, are good portals for aliens to come in and out, and the Shroud of Turin is evidence of that. I don't know what experimental data they put forward to test that hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis. I'm not sure as scientists, Bob and I would actually grace it with the title hypothesis, which sounds more scientific than it is. But there are hypotheses. I think Bob's is more undermining of the carbon dating accuracy than the idea that caves are portals for aliens.
Okay, cool. So that means that the only reason you're maintaining that on the basis of the 1988 carbon 14 dating is on the basis of outside evidence, outside of. So by that, what did you mean by that? Is it something that's related to the empirical dating of the Shroud,
yes,
or is it like?
The Shroud was quite likely to be medieval long before the carbon date, and the carbon date confirmed that it was medieval. I mean, from my point of view.
Okay. All right, cool. So you can get from that. Stop sharing, and basically that just proves what I just said. Epistemically speaking, my undercutting defeater remains undefeated in terms of providing the Bob Rucker response, the statistical and systemic bot error response that defeats the truth of premise 2 because it provides an equally probable explanatory hypothesis that even Hugh's admitting look, we have no way of distinguishing between these various explanatory hypotheses. Bob Rooker is equally probable player on the scene. And as long as that one is an equally probable player on the scene, you cannot establish that the Shroud is in fact medieval because of the carbon 14 dating results in isolation. Again, obviously Hugh will say he appeals to outside evidence, things the papal bull from the 1300s or something, totally irrelevant. We're looking at the carbon 14. We'll get to that other stuff and evaluate that in detail in the next segment, actually. But for now, it's just important to say that pro-Shroud experts have won. We've succeeded in providing an undefeated undercutting defeater for the carbon for Shroud skeptics claim that the Shroud is probably medieval on the basis of the carbon 14. Now, one thing just before we move on from the carbon 14 dating, a couple of things. So I want to mention Bob Rooker is different than me. So I simply try to provide an undercutting defeater, and I've succeeded. But Bob goes further. He actually tries to he uses the carbon 14 dating results or data, and he uses that as a rebutting defeater. So a rebutting defeater is different than an undercutting one, right? The undercutting defeater, you bear no burden of proof. You just say, yeah, but what if this hypothesis is true? Can you falsify that since you're making the claim, skeptic? No. Hugh admits, no, you can't falsify Bob Rooker's hypothesis. Then you lose. You're not justified in believing the Shroud's medieval then. A rebutting defeater is different. Bob is actually taking on a burden of proof, and he's making a factual claim. He's saying, look, the 1988 carbon 14 dating results, give me those, baby, because that proves factually the Shroud, that premise 2 is false. It's probably false. The Shroud is not medieval, and that's independent, solely based on the carbon 14 dating results. And Hughes is because we have 4 data points. Number 1, you have the raw values obtained. Number 2, you have the range of the dates. 3, you have that slope, 36 years per centimeter. And fourthly, he ties in the Sudarium of Oviedo, dating to 700 AD, as per his hypothesis predicted in advance type thing, implicitly predicted, obviously, because when he did his original calculations, he wasn't thinking about the Sudarium. But so Bob actually goes further than I do in saying, no, we can prove on the basis of this data that the Shroud is not medieval. Probably not medieval. That premise 2 is probably false, as a matter of fact. As I was just saying with Hugh, he was saying, no, they're equally probable. Bob's making a different claim here. He's saying, no, they're not equally probable. My neutron absorption hypothesis is better. It's superior. You should believe that on a balance of probabilities. And okay, great. He bears that burden of proof, and obviously go to shroudresearch.net. I'm sure he's taken up that burden of proof and provided that warrant. One last point on the carbon 14, and it's kind of based on a theological objection. So a lot of times with fundamentally Shroud skeptics like David Johnson or Allen, I remember back in the day when I mentioned Bob Rooker's hypothesis, and they would say, oh, well, if God created miraculous Shroud images, why on earth would he confuse people by allowing the Shroud to just so happen, pretend it went through a neutron absorption hypothesis. So Bob Rooker's vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis, let's pretend that's true for a second. Why on earth would God do that? That's a tricky God. That's a confusing God, because by doing that, he just happened to give an erroneous carbon 14 dating result in 1988 that just happened to correspond to the Shroud skeptics' claims that the Shroud is just a medieval relic and a fake and a fraud and all this stuff. Why does it just coincidentally line up with the Shroud skeptics? And I was in defense mode, so I would provide Molinistic reasons and stuff like that. God wants people to be real seekers, so he's giving them a stumbling block to dig into, to research, to develop salvation fit character traits in order to eventually be saved. God just doesn't want us to have intellectual propositional belief. I believe Jesus died from the dead, rose from the dead. I believe this. It's more than that. We have to develop salvation fit character traits. And that may entail us having to develop a hunger, a thirst, an appreciation for the truth, and skills trying to grow ourselves and trying to find the answers, not just getting immediate, intellectually lazy answers like the skeptics seem to want a lot of times, right? At least the lay variety on the internet. But I just wanted to point out their hypocrisy. So when I'm saying Shroud skeptics here, I'm not referring to Hugh Ferry. He puts in the work. He's, in my opinion, a real seeker, at least on the Shroud. I don't know about other topics, but people like, David Johnson from SNS or Darren Lute, these types of people. So here we can flip the script on them. Why on earth is it that God didn't just provide us with these raw values showing that the Shroud is medieval in correspondence with the Shroud skeptics claim? He also gave us those other data points that Bob Rucker mentioned. He also gave us the range of dates. He also gave us the slope. He also gave us external proofs proving that the Shroud is not medieval and that sort of thing. So basically, you could make a reverse providential thing and says that, well, look, God also provided us simultaneously with those carbon-14 dating results. He gave us the slope and the range of dates, proving that it is not medieval, given Bob Rucker's rebutting defeater there, and or at the very least, sufficient evidence for everyone to know that we can't have confidence that the Shroud's medieval on the basis of this totally uncredible evidence type thing that we have. So yeah, I think these types of theological providential questions as to, well, why would God allow that to happen in 1988 to get this particular date? It's not taking into account, but don't forget, God gave us the means to know that that was false, not only from external evidences, but from the carbon dating evidence itself. He gave us the range and the slope as well. I think that those types of theological objections are just utter failures. And I just wanted to add that because I remember that was something that Alan and David Johnson brought up on my Shroud Wars Round 1 debate. All right, cool. So that's it in terms of the carbon dating. Like I said, in terms of all the other details, reference Shroud Wars panel review show number 1, as well as my prior shows between Bob Rucker, Hugh Ferry, or Joe Marino and Hugh Ferry. And one of my favorites, Bob Rucker versus Joe Marino, with helpful visual images. And trust me, it's hours and hours of very intense details as to why we conclude what we do here. Okay, with that said, let's try for the next topic. So obviously the Shroud skeptic has failed to prove the truth of premise 2, that the Shroud is probably medieval on the basis of the carbon-14. But remember the external evidence that Hugh mentioned. Shroud skeptics aren't done. There's another incredible evidence that that I covered in my Shroud panel review show, part 2. And this is basically the 1389 Bishop Darcy memorandum that claims the Shroud is a medieval fake. The artist confessed during an inquiry in the 1350s that, I just created this thing, it's all a fake. And surrounding that, there are other medieval documents. Someone like Hugh Ferry will dismiss the memo. We'll get to that in a second. But he'll appeal to some of the papal bulls, some of these medieval documents from the 14th century that allege to or purport to prove the Shroud is indeed a medieval fake. And in terms of dating, it dates to the 14th century. It didn't belong to Jesus. So I want to get into my assessment of these medieval documents, the memo and the other medieval documents and letters that we have, and what's my take on that.
And okay, just before we get into that, just wanted to finish off my assessment on the carbon-14 dating and conducted the math for each of these defeaters that have been raised. So in the first place, in terms of the carbon-14 dating as a proof for the truth of premise 2, that the Shroud is probably medieval, we presented 4 undercutting defeaters. The first was the general unreliability of the AMS carbon-14 dating method in 1988. We were presented with a proper full-on defeater. So we would have 0% doubt, and basically that means that we're still 100% confident that the carbon-14 dating is reliable at proving the Shroud to be medieval. Then we had the fact that they only used one sample location, and that's an insufficient sample size. So this defeater was successful, but in reducing the amount of justification, but it's still, according to Bob and Hugh, it shouldn't lower it very much. So I assigned about a 5 to 10% probability of doubt, meaning there's a 90 to 95% probability. Again, these are my own subjective probabilities based on my second round of research. And remember, I always do 3 total rounds, the third being the most rigorous to provide myself with warrant. But again, just going through the numbers to show you how I would approach this in my second round of investigation. So it's about 90 to 95% proven that the carbon-14 dating results are reliable in proving the Shroud to be medieval, despite the fact they only dated one sample. I always go with the worst case scenario for my side, on the pro Shroud side. So I said 95% proven reliable. Number 3, the sample was non-representative to the rest of the cloth, and I split this up into 2 factors, given Bob Rucker's comments in my Shroud panel show number 1. So the first are factors relevant to either ordinary contamination and or the invisible reweave hypothesis of Joe Marino. And on this front, I'm convinced by the defeaters for the most part, but I do think that it is plausible. The invisible reweave hypothesis is plausible. So I assigned a 10 to 20% doubt for that factor, which means I'm about 80% to 90%, and I always assume the worst case for the pro Shroud guys, so that would be 90% proven reliable, that the carbon-14 results are reliable given the factors relevant to the invisible reweave. You remember the blue quad mosaic, the cotton interwoven with the linen, Alan Adler's salt findings, the fact they found wax and tallow and other contaminants in the sample location. But again, Bob counters that with they did a huge cleaning which stripped off all of that. It would be impossible for it not to be clean. He counters, Hughes countered the blue quad mosaic. Yeah, but there are other corners that also show this, and we can't prove that it's because of an invisible reweave that it's green like this, right? So it could be other factors that are responsible for this. And finally, we have Dr. Alan Adler's salt findings that suggest that there might be an invisible reweave. And on that last factor, I don't have a defeater that I was able to find in my research. But again, I haven't investigated that thoroughly. I've never asked Bob Rucker or Hugh Ferry about that specific factor, and I've never looked for a counter to that. I'm sure there may be something out there, so that would be something I would save for my third round. But again, I'm doing this in light of the fact that I don't have a defeater for that specific empirical result. More importantly, the other reasons I think it's plausible is because I also think that there's somewhat persuasive arguments that Joe Marino and others have gone and said, look, there is such a thing as invisible reweaving. There are entire books on it. Is it a technique that existed? I'm pretty sure that it is, based on Joe Marino's research and that sort of thing. That said, I'm also persuaded heavily by Bob. Obviously I agree with him. I think it's very, very improbable that the invisible reweave could be so invisible that the medieval Shroud person could make it in the medieval period, and it would be so invisible, even you wouldn't see it with compound microscopes and that sort of thing. We have no known examples that we've actually studied and confirmed have such a sophisticated invisible reweave that a lot of textile experts have examined and haven't been able to find any evidence from it from their examination and observations. So these kind of counters, and by Bob kind of counters this. Joe Marino. Then finally we have this scholarly consensus, including enemy attestation from people like Ray Rogers, who were skeptics and wanted to disprove it, and then investigated and realized, according to them, they were wrong and changed their mind to believe in the invisible reweave. I think the scholarly consensus counts for something, and it's probably the most persuasive that the invisible reweave hypothesis has going for it, in my estimation, based on my second round of investigation here. But again, scholarly consensus can be wrong, and again, when you get into the details, there are some issues with it, and that's why I'm not persuaded to think, this is a good defeater on a balance of probabilities. No, I think it's very improbable, 80 to 90% improbable that the invisible reweave is true, based on all factors considered, and that includes things. Again, check out my debate between Bob Rucker and Joe Marino. That was an excellent source, and I think Bob raised a few things. I mean, it's just mathematically contradictory. I mean, you would have to have 80% material coming from the medieval period in this patch, and then 20% from the time of Jesus to get the results we did. There are issues with the statistical calculations. How does the invisible reweave account for the slope? 36 years per centimeter is the line of best fit in terms of the results. I think it struggles there. And then, drawing a blank, there was something else I wanted to mention as well. But basically, I think the evidence on the other side is stronger against this hypothesis. But like I said, see the experts themselves. This theory is plausible and deserves respect and deserves to be seriously considered. So please go check out Joe Marino's excellent book on the 1988 carbon dating. I've linked to it. Check out my previous shows with him and hear the best that side has to offer. Okay, great. So that's that factor there. Then we have the big baby, the one that destroys the Shroud skeptic. The statistical problems and systematic error. Bob Rucker's type argument that even the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry admitted totally destroys any Shroud skeptic using carbon dating alone to try and prove the Shroud is in fact medieval. This is an undefeated defeater. It has the principle of enemy attestation. I am absolutely warranted in believing that there is a 50% or less. And trust me, if I assign my real numbers, I'm less. I'm at like 0% probably, or 0 to 5%, in favor that the carbon-14 has been proven reliable. We are justified in believing it is reliable on the basis of this factor, the statistical problems and the systematic error, with a 98.6% proven systemic error to be at place. You can't believe it. At the best, you have to be agnostic, or in fact, you should probably disbelieve or disbelieve that you have any epistemic right to believe the Shroud is medieval on the basis of the carbon-14 alone. Just a note here, the reason I just say 50% or less rather than assigning a specific number is because in Bayesian terminology, it doesn't matter. Anything less than 50% counts against the given hypothesis. And obviously I'm not saying that the failure as an undercutting defeater, I don't need to go down that road. I don't need to say, well, anything less than 50% should mean that it's improbable that the carbon-14 results represent the actual calendar age, and or that one is unjustified in believing that the carbon-14 represents the actual calendar age of the Shroud. For that's where we look to Bob Rucker's rebutting defeater version of this statistical thing, where Bob Rucker makes the positive claim that no, it is in fact improbable, provably improbable, and therefore you should disbelieve that the Shroud is medieval, and that premise 2 is, therefore you should think premise 2 is false in the Shroud skeptic's argument on the basis of the carbon-14 data alone. Now, I've assigned an NA to that because, again, I don't try to adopt any burden of proof for strategic reasons. Doesn't mean I agree with Bob Rucker that, you can phrase this as a rebutting defeater, but when I approach the carbon-14 dating with a Shroud skeptic, I purposefully do not want to take on a burden of proof. And that's why I only present Bob's work as an undercutting defeater to say, I have no burden of proof, you have all the proof, skeptic, prove the carbon-14 is reliable and shows that the Shroud is probably medieval. Here are the problems. What do you say to this? Do you have a defeater for Bob's statistical work? No? Then you fail. I don't believe you're not warranted or justified in believing the Shroud is medieval, then you have to just wait and see for more evidence to come in to adjudicate with the carbon-14. So yeah, that's my take there. So obviously, putting it all together, look, 100% for undercutting defeater number 1 times 95% for the one sampled undercutting defeater times 90% for Joe Marino's invisible reweave undercutting defeater times 50% or less, but I'm putting in 50 for the worst case for the Pro Shroud side, for the statistical problems and systematic errors in the dates obtained and the slope and the range. So yeah, it's less than 50%. It's 50% or less. Anything that is 50% or less in Bayesian terminology is a failure. Don't believe it. Don't believe the Shroud is medieval. Don't believe the carbon-14 is reliable. You are totally unjustified. At best, you should be agnostic. You should say, I don't know whether the Shroud is medieval or not, based on the carbon-14 alone. That's what you should say. At worst, from the Shroud skeptic's perspective, you should disbelieve. If you take on board Bob Rucker's rebutting defeater and go for that, then it would be improbable, very improbable even, that the carbon-14's medieval dates represent the actual calendar age of the Shroud, and therefore you should disbelieve it. Again, I don't go that far. I stick with the undercutting defeater, and whatever is best for the Shroud skeptic and against the Pro Shroud. So I'm just saying, look, you're totally unjustified. You're totally unwarranted. Epistemically speaking, you should suspend judgment. You should be agnostic as to whether the carbon-14 proves anything in terms of the Shroud's actual calendar age. Yeah, so that's it. Let's move on to the next topic segment there.